Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and the harvests are really starting to come in here in Maine. I'm enjoying fresh corn, peppers, tomatoes, green beans, and potatoes. It's pretty awesome right now. In another week or two, I should be able to cut back the meadow flowers and lay the rest of my no-dig garden to really sit and break down over winter and be ready to plant up in the spring. I kind of like the idea of, having garden beds that are going to be sort of curing over winter while there's not a lot going on. I'm able to really use that time to focus on other projects rather than worrying about, I've got to do all this come spring with the garden. So this is one of the good reasons why I love no-dig gardening. But also during this time, we're planning on getting fencing. Where's the fencing going to be going up? And, really kind of protecting that new garden that's going to be ready for the next season. Because this year, as I always say, your first year gardening is usually the hardest because there's so many things that are going on. There's a lot of differences with the land, and maybe you're trying out different gardening styles. It's really a year of kind of experimenting and seeing what things work and what don't. And I've had some really great insight from people that live near me, people that have grown food nearby, whether they're doing it sort of on a larger farming scale, but also on a smaller scale to supplement, food that they're getting from the grocery store, which is really kind of nice. Like, gardeners are always very open about how they grow and what they get excited about. It's really nice to see how freely we share information within kind of the gardening communities. And fencing was one of those things that we realized after visiting a few places. We really need some fencing to stop a lot of the critters. Like, I've got a lot of deer that have been moving around and through my property, especially since we cut back a lot of the tall weeds that were there. We had like a lot of goldenrod and indigo and stuff that was growing, so a lot of that's been cut back, and now we've got lots of different animals moving in. For those of you that are on the Facebook group, you might have seen my post where I mentioned about the groundhog that's been eating stuff. Oh my gosh, that groundhog's eaten a lot of stuff. I don't know whether to be concerned. My husband was Googling whether he could eat groundhog. I don't know whether to be concerned by that. But there's definitely a groundhog population on our property, and there used to be some foxes on our property, but I think just all the mowing and stuff that we've been doing has kind of deterred them from the area, which is kind of sad because they were really good at helping to keep down a lot of the rodents. So there's just been a lot of stuff going on here on our property, like a lot of big earthworks have been happening. Like, we had to have a new leach field put in. We had a giant 3-story chicken barn get pulled down. There was a lot of stuff going on. So I'm not surprised that the animals that once called our homestead home have moved or found something new, and we've got new animals kind of coming in. These things kind of happen, but fencing is really going to help my new garden next year be protected from some of those bigger predators, so I've got a better chance of things growing. Because a lot of the stuff that I've been growing, even things that are deer resistant, they've been eaten by the deer or they've been eaten by the groundhog. So there's been a lot of things that have been eating stuff before we've had a chance. So that's one of the things that's kind of making me move to a different garden model. Not just that, is some really great benefits to having like these no dig or sheet mulch kind of gardens, and I've grown that way for a number of years in different climates, and it's the gardening method that I always tend to fall back to in some way, shape or form. So in the wider garden, that's going to be the areas that are outside of the fence when we get this fencing put in and these new beds laid down. A lot of potatoes are coming out. I've got wood chip that's still going down on those garden beds, because some of those garden beds are going to be turned into native flower beds to help bring in those pollinators and those beneficial insects into the garden. That's part of my overall integrated pest management scheme for the land. But some beds I'm going to let the pasture take them back over. I mean, they're already halfway there in some cases, but really let the pasture take them back. We're getting animals next year. We're going to be planning on turning those out into some of these pasture areas to graze and forage. Weeds are really taking over some of those garden beds. It has been a very long and difficult battle this year with getting on top of some of these weeds, and rather than spending more energy and more time fighting a battle with the weeds, especially with the season winding down, it makes a lot more sense on our homestead to convert to that no dig gardening method and start those sheet mulch layer beds ready for the next season. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, is no dig gardening, because as somebody who works full time, I want to spend time enjoying my garden, right? I do not want to be spending all the time weeding a garden. And that was kind of one of the things. I would spend time out in the garden on an evening, and I'd be weeding a little bit, and then I would mulch the area that I weeded and stuff. And I started seeing really good progress down my tomato row, which was great. But I would always be kind of looking over at where my no dig beds were, and they were just gloriously weed free, and it was kind of demoralizing. Weeding, and I'm sort of busting through, taking out these weeds, laying them down, and then okay, now I'm gonna go get some mulch and wood chips and stuff and cover it. And I've been like creating as much mulch and stuff as I can on the homestead, like all the junk mail and stuff that I was getting, I was shredding it, and then that was going out to the garden to become mulch. And I've had pretty good success with junk mail, shredded junk mail as mulch recently, which is great, because my summer squashes and stuff have finally recovered from the groundhog eating them, and now we're starting to get patty pans coming out, which is great because I absolutely adore patty pans. They're one of my favorite things to grow, so I was very excited that we're finally getting them to grow. And there's been one particular variety of patty pan that I have been trying to grow for the last 5-6 years, and I've not had any success until this year, and so that's been really good, and that's definitely a positive win for me. But one of the good things about all this shredded paper and stuff that I've been putting down as a mulch is I think it's been reflecting a lot more light up onto the plants, so they've just been able to be growing a lot better. So not only is it keeping the water in, it's keeping the weeds out, it's also helping to reflect some light, so I'm getting harvests that are, or produce that is maturing a little faster, so I'm able to harvest it a little quicker. And now I'm realizing that I have to harvest things a little earlier to help get them before the chipmunks or the groundhog or anything else gets them. So nuances like that are being learned in the garden. But no dig gardening is, like I said, it's something that I always seem to come back to. And I learned about no dig gardening a long time ago, when I still lived in the UK. There was a very prominent gardener called Charles Dowding who wrote a book about it, and it was very interesting to read, because that's not how my grandparents taught me to garden. It was very much like, double dig all of these beds, and then you plant things, and you're adding in your compost, and you're digging it all into mixing it all up. And this was a really novel idea, that you were not going to be digging in this stuff anymore, but just layering it on top. And then as I moved over here to the US, and I started seeing how other people are gardening and different things becoming available, like books or through YouTube and blogs and all that kind of stuff, like I started to learn a bit more and learned about this kind of sheet mulching technique. And this is what I use a lot of now is sheet mulching. And some of this stuff like worked really well. Certainly in the UK, where, you know, you have some weeds, you know, maybe the couch grass and stuff is a little bit of a pain to deal with. Bindweed, right? Those are two that would come to mind in the allotment all the time, was couch grass and bindweed. But having, you know, have a lot more tenacious weeds out here in the US to deal with, like there's been some really interesting ways that people have dealt with weeds. But having cardboard seems to be like the crux of all of it. Like a good cardboard base is what has really allowed a lot of people garden in areas that you didn't think was possible for growing food. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about my neighbors let me visit their garden recently, and they let me take some sweet peppers, which was great because the groundhog and deer have totally eaten our plants, and I'm kind of bummed about that because I basically sowed out the last of my sweet pepper seed and was really hoping for some solid seed saving this year, and I've gotten no sweet peppers whatsoever. The plants have all been like nibbled right off. Every time they grow a bit, something comes along and nibbles them again. I've tried covering it and it just like stuff's kind of busted through. Like it's not happening. So I was very grateful for them to say, hey, yeah, go get some peppers out of our garden. And whilst I was there visiting their garden, I was able to kind of see how a longer term no-dig garden grew here in Maine. And there are a number of things that I was able to see. So the first thing was really abundant growth. Like the plants that were there were thriving in the soil, which only has compost added on there and then wood chip as the pathways. Crops that were growing there were laden with flowers and fruits, and the greens that were growing there, like cabbages and kale and stuff, they were big and lush and leafy. They hadn't been eaten, unlike mine. You know, there was a clear level of abundance that was happening in this garden. The second thing that I noticed was the soil health, and as I was kind of walking around the garden, I could feel how spongy the soil was, and it recovered quickly after me kind of stepping on stuff. And you know, I am not a small girl. I am you know, on the heavier side, and it was really interesting to see that the ground itself would kind of, you know, you could see where my feet had been, and you know, it compressed a bit, but then it started to kind of release a bit more like a sponge. So the soil was evidently healthy. It held moisture very well. It was easy to plant into with your hands. You could just kind of put your hand in to make a hole. You didn't really need any tools to be able to work the soil. The soil was obviously light. It was easy for the plant roots to grow into, and plants were clearly thriving. And the third thing I noticed in my neighbour's garden was there was very few weeds, and this wasn't really because my neighbours are always weeding it. There's less weeds because the soil isn't being disturbed. So dormant seeds that are in the soil, they're not being woken up with the air and the light exposure that happens when you till and dig a garden bed, and then they end up taking over things. So, you know, it was a lot less work that was being done for a clearly abundant garden that was producing a lot of stuff. I mean, their beans this year are crazy. I spent a long time in my neighbor's garden. I was like trying to find out like what varieties of stuff they were growing. Like, was it the variety that was making a difference, or is it just kind of how their garden was growing? So when I was looking at my own garden, the no-till beds, again, they've got very few weeds on them, whilst the pasture is clearly reclaiming those that I have dug and tilled this year to plant. So I'm definitely moving my entire garden to a no-till garden model. Like, digging will happen when I'm harvesting potatoes or ginormous parsnips, but otherwise my digging tools can become decor in the shed. I do not want to be busting up any more ground and have, you know, more of the battle that has been going on, because the only thing that kind of comes when you are trying to fight the weeds a lot is frustration. And that's really one of the number one things that I hear from new gardeners, is they're frustrated by having to deal with weeds all the time. And this might be a better gardening method for you as well, especially if you're busy and you're trying to manage all of the things, right? I don't know who isn't trying to manage all of the things these days. But if you have, not a lot of time and you are really wanting to have a garden to be able to provide food for your family, you want to know where your food's coming from, right? That's the number one reason really why people are growing their own food, because you want to know how it was grown. You want to know what went into it. You want to make sure that it's not been grown with lots of, weird and wonderful pesticides and stuff. You want to avoid all that in your food, but you don't want to be paying the hefty price tag of growing organic. And guess what? You can grow organically at home. So how do you start a no-dig or no-till garden? Well, you want to be grabbing yourself a bunch of cardboard. Right, that's kind of what I mentioned earlier. Is cardboard seems to be, the crux of everything in this. So get yourself a bunch of cardboard. You're going to need a lot of cardboard. You want enough to cover the area of your garden beds, and you want enough to be giving yourself more than one layer. So ask neighbors, friends, family, your co-workers, your boss, the grocery store manager, whoever. Like, you want to be seeing about getting cardboard and taking it off their hands. I've got cardboard from neighbors. I got cardboard from moving. I had a lot of cardboard left over from moving house. But any cardboard that we've had, like from stuff being delivered, we kept. We kept all of it, and it's all been kind of put down in the garden. Still working on putting stuff down, right? As I mentioned earlier, like I'm waiting to be able to cut back some things that are in flower. There's a lot of milkweed at the minute, and there's clearly monarch caterpillars on them. So I'm not cutting things back until the caterpillars have gone through their evolution into butterflies the metamorphosis, into butterflies, and have moved on. So I'm waiting for that to happen before I put down more beds. But get as much of the cardboard as you can, and then once you have a bunch, you want to be flattening the boxes out. So you just want them so they collapse flat. You don't want to open them out fully to make them wider and one layer. You want to keep them double flat. So, like if you're buying moving boxes from, the hardware store, how they come flat like that. That's kind of how you want them. You want flat boxes, double layers. And try and take off as much tape as you can if you've got a bunch of boxes that have been taped up, because you don't really want to be having tape fluttering around the garden later. So try and take off as much tape as you can. You might get bored of doing that eventually, taking off the tape and just putting it down in the garden. That's cool too. Don't worry too much about it. But you might be picking up bits of tape later on as you're gardening, so that's fine. But with your flattened boxes at the ready, you want to be deciding where your new no-till garden is going to go, right? You want to be maximizing the amount of sun that you will get for your property to help things ripen. I have a north-facing slope that is banked by trees on the east and the west. So guess what? In early morning, I get a lot of shade coming until the sun has risen above those trees. And as the sun is moving across the sky, I got relatively good sun exposure during the day, but then as the evening comes, that sun dips down towards the trees. The minute that it hits that tree line, I get a lot of shade. So I try to get the most amount of light as I possibly can. For me, that's kind of growing a lot of stuff in the middle and trying to avoid a lot of where the shade comes in from the tree line, which isn't completely avoidable on the west side. Like I get a lot of shade coming on there, but I try to maximize the amount of sun that I can get from the early morning too. So it can be a weedy area of your garden. So if you have a very weedy spot that's going to become your next garden, you want to either mow it or like whack it all down, like get the weed eater out. So you just want to let that plant material sit on the ground. If you've got a bag attachment on your mower to catch the grass clippings and stuff, you can empty that back onto the ground. It doesn't matter. If you don't have a mower, you don't have any way to kind of hack those weeds down, you can pull them up by hand and then just drop them down, or you can trample the weeds down so they lay flat-ish against the ground. That's totally fine. You just want it so you can actually put the cardboard down and get good contact between the cardboard and the ground. And that's the next thing that we're going to do, is we're going to lay that cardboard on top. You want to be overlapping the cardboard as you lay new pieces down by a good few inches. We want really good coverage of that cardboard to block the weeds coming up. Some people, if you don't have a lot of like overly tenacious weeds, you can get away with that one layer of cardboard. And by that one layer, I mean a flattened cardboard box, not an opened out cardboard box, just to flattened it down so you've got the two sides together. Other areas, if you've got very problematic weeds that you're trying to do, you're going to want at least 2, maybe even 3 layers of cardboard to really like help block those weeds coming up. After laying that cardboard, it's a good time to actually wet it. So you want to like wet things down so the cardboard will stay put. Water is going to get absorbed by that cardboard. It gives it weight and makes it harder for the wind to move it, which is important if you are going to be like leaving it just as the cardboard for a couple of weeks. From this point on, though, it's really down to what you have available for your no-dig garden bed layers. Each layer you put down is going to be something that will decompose and break down, or something that's going to provide nutrients. And it really just depends what you have available. Some people will put, partially cured manure down. Other people put fully cured manure down. Some people don't use manure, they just use compost. Other people don't use either, and they just use cardboard. So I'm going to tell you about some things that I've used and things that I've seen other gardeners use. So after putting the cardboard down, I have actually layered compost and bag soil on top and covered the beds with leaves or straw. I did that when I was back out in Utah. That garden grew very well. It got established very quickly. I was able to plant straight into that compost and sort of bag soil mixture that was on there, and then as those transplants were getting established, the cardboard and the other layers were breaking down, so they provided fuel for those plants to grow, and I was able to have pretty good harvest going from there. So that worked well when I had those things and the funds available to do it. Some other gardeners I've seen, they layer fall leaves on top of the cardboard, then compost, either compost that they've made or they've brought in from somewhere else, then cover with straw or wood chips. There's also gardeners who just cover the cardboard with wood chips, saving the compost to add into the planting hole when plants are being transplanted. So the idea for that would be, let's say that you want to plant a row of beans or peas or something. You would move over some of those wood chips so you could get closer to the ground, add some compost into like the row that you've made, so like make a little divot down and add some compost, put your seeds in, and then cover with a bit more compost, and then cover with some wood chips to help kind of keep the moisture in, because your plants are still going to grow up through just as they would if it was directly into the soil. So that's another tip for you if you don't have a lot of stuff, and that's kind of the approach that I'm taking because I don't have a lot of compost. And with my no-dig beds, I basically had to use whatever materials that I had available. That was cardboard from moving house and wood chip that came from a local place that was clearing down trees and brush after a storm. So the wood chips that I've got is a mix of like woody bits with shredded twigs and leaves, and I've just put that straight on top of the cardboard. And I've made my wood chips about 4 to 6 inches deep because I've got some really horrific weeds, and I really don't want those to be making a reappearance. So I've got pretty thick layers of wood chip and stuff. And what I'm going to be doing is I'll be moving the wood chips to a side, or I'll be making, a hole into the wood chips to be able to get closer to the ground when I need to put in my transplants or put in my seeds. I really don't have enough compost to spread anywhere. Otherwise, I would have put compost on top of the cardboard, then covered it with the wood chips. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. That's very much the mentality of how our homestead is rolling right now. And, that's the same approach that you can do too. Really, these materials are going to be breaking down. They're going to be providing the nutrients for the soil that's going to help your garden grow. So if you've got things available, right, because let's say you've got chickens and you have chicken manure and you have a lot of that and you want to use that, you can use that sort of stuff to build these new beds. Just know that if you're using things with manure in them, you need to leave it 120 days before you can really be harvesting anything from that land. So actually putting these things in over winter is not necessarily a bad thing, because it's got time for things to break down and the risk of pathogens and stuff to disappear. And pathogens, of course, are disease causing microorganisms that are going to make us sick, and we don't want that in our garden. So use what you have. Do what you can. Your garden is going to grow, and as it grows, you're going to be generating more material for your compost heap anyway. So you can start building more compost that's going to feed and improve the soil, which is ultimately going to help your garden grow. So that cycle is going to begin. Compost is very important in no-dig and no-till gardens because it provides nutrients and beneficial microorganisms that help your plants, thrive. But you got to start somewhere, and not everybody has, the money to be able to buy bags of compost or, get a couple of yards or whatever delivered, right? Sometimes other things come up and come in the way, and there are other things that you can use if you get creative. Other people use grass clippings. Especially if you've got a lawn and you're already collecting them up, you can totally use grass clippings, as long as you don't treat your grass clippings with any sort of pesticide or herbicide or anything. That's also fine. So you can really get quite creative with what can be going into your sheet mulch gardens, and there's a lot of different information available that you can look up and research and find what works for you on your homestead. But realistically, once you get your no-till garden bed kind of set up, the most that you're going to be doing is adding compost every year, and that's just kind of layering on top of your garden beds to help keep your soil fertile, which is in turn going to help keep your plants healthy, which then provides you with nutrient dense fresh veggies. So I would love to hear from you. Are you going to be growing in a no-dig garden? Let me know over in the Facebook group. And until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I'll see you all next week.